câmera, tá? Quem não quiser aparecer. E o debate, na verdade, ele vai durar aí mais ou menos em torno de 1 hora e meia, né? A gente tem como teto 1 hora e meia. E eu queria apresentar para vocês, né, quem que é o Romain Geniez. I don't know if I told you correctly.
Very good pronunciation. That's a kind of spectacular pronunciation for a non-French speaker.
O Romain, ele vai falar sobre o texto dele, né, que é a Fundamentación de la objetividad de los derechos humanos y viabilidad teórica del no-positivismo, reflexiones sobre la metafísica de Robert Alexy. Ele é doutorando, né, em Direito Público e Filosofia na Universidade de Geniez, do Instituto Tarello, e Universidade de Paris, Nanterre. Francês eu não sei muito bem. E a gente também vai contar hoje com o debate do João Costa Neto, que vai colocar também alguns pontos sobre o texto, né? O professor João Costa Neto, ele é professor doutor da Faculdade de Direito da UNB, da Universidade de Brasília, por onde ele também é doutor e mestre, né? Ele é doutorando em Direito Público pela Humboldt-Universität de Berlim, né? Mestre em Direito Romano pela Faculdade de Direito da USP. Ele é juiz de direito do Tribunal de Justiça de São Paulo e atualmente está convocado como juiz auxiliar no gabinete do ministro do Supremo Tribunal Federal. A gente vai ter o debate desses dois experts em Robert Alexy.
Experts, my goodness.
Queria agradecer muito a presença do Romain Geniez e a presença também do professor João Costa Neto, que aceitou o nosso convite para também debater esse texto, né, e ajudar a gente...
Rebeca, desculpa interromper, mas também eu acho que faz parte um pouco da qualificação do João dizer que ele é um dos... Está desde o início no pós-debate, né, comprou essa ideia, ajudou muito...
Acho que é o mais valioso que eu guardo, viu? Fico muito feliz, é uma...
Mas queria...
Desde o início ele tá no pós-debate, então acho que até um prazer ele participar agora. Ele viu a criação do pós-debate lá atrás, agora a gente ainda não programou nenhum evento de 5 anos de comemoração do pós-debate, mas eu acho que ter a presença do João debatendo esse texto aqui já é de alguma forma um símbolo aí dos 5 anos do pós-debate. Muito obrigado, João.
Obrigada, João.
As palavras tão amáveis.
E para nós é muito interessante também ter esse tipo de debate, que né, o Romain vai apresentar o texto dele, o João, que também é expert no assunto, vai pontuar. Então, para nós é bem interessante, né, ter duas pessoas ali debatendo temas, né, que as duas pessoas têm conhecimento, né, e eu acho que na academia é isso, a gente tem que ouvir, falar, e depois que o João fizer as pontuações, a gente vai abrir para vocês fazerem as perguntas. O Romain vai fazer a apresentação dele em inglês. Ele entende um pouquinho de português, mas aí, assim, se vocês quiserem fazer a pergunta diretamente em inglês ou espanhol, ele consegue entender. Se vocês não têm, né, eu tô com um pouco de vergonha, podem mandar aqui no chat ou fazer em português e a gente traduz para ele, né? Então sintam-se à vontade, né? Na verdade a gente quer deixar esse ambiente bem à vontade também para vocês, né? Bom, eu acho que a gente pode começar. E, de novo, para quem entrou agora, esse debate está sendo gravado, então se você não quiser ter a sua imagem gravada ou a sua voz, a gente pede só para você desligar o vídeo se você não quiser ser gravado. Na verdade, a ideia é no futuro a gente criar um canal do pós-debate no YouTube e começar a disponibilizar esses vídeos, né, de debates que a gente teve, tornar o pós-debate mais conhecido. Um outro detalhe que eu esqueci de falar é que com, né, a pandemia, a gente fala, é um momento bem difícil, né, para a gente, mas também trouxe algo que a gente não tinha pensado de como também esse meio virtual ele consegue alcançar, né, outras partes do Brasil e até outros países. E estão todas e todos convidados para participar dos próximos encontros do pós-debate, para enviarem seus textos, né? A gente tem um site do pós-debate e, na verdade, aqui o grupo ele é realmente assim, é um grupo de debate de ideias. Vocês podem mandar seus textos, ainda que estejam em desenvolvimento, para a gente poder debater e vocês aprimorarem as ideias, né? Com críticas e sugestões, tá bom? So, I think you can start, Romain. I don't know if you both want to share something, so I open to you both, or if not, Romain, you can start your presentation.
Well, first of all, as a matter of preliminary, if I may say so, talk, I'd like to say that I am glad to be here and to participate in the in this group of discussion of the University of São Paulo, as other members of the Tarello Institute before me have come and participated. I'm thinking about, of course, Luis Matricardi, who's from the USP, but also from the Tarello Institute, and also Giovanni Battista Ratti. So I am glad I participate into, let us say, bridging, if I may say so, the two institutions. So it's my pleasure to be here, to be sharing with you, and to have Professor Costa Neto to give me his thoughts about my paper. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
So shall I start then? Okay. So maybe Professor Costa Neto wants to say a few words before I go on.
No, thank you. Thank you very much. It's an honor to be here. It's very nice to talk with you. And as I said, I was at the very beginning of this thing. So it's an honor to have you here, and such a beautiful theme for us to discuss. Thank you. Please go ahead.
Thank you. Okay, so let's jump right into the paper. So the paper I'm going to present today is a part of my doctoral thesis that deals, at least partly, with Robert Alexy's system of legal philosophy. So as Robert Alexy is quite a rock star here in Brazil, as he has received 12 honorary degrees here, which is stupendous. You are all well aware of his legal system. You know that it is composed of three main pillars. The first pillar being the theory, the general theory of practical discourse and legal argumentation. The second being the theory of constitutional rights. And the third being the problem of the concept and the nature of law. So here we are going to discuss a matter that stems from the pillar that deals with the concept and the nature of law. So I shall start by introducing and contextualizing a little bit the problem here. As you have seen, that the paper I've sent is rather dense, so I'm going to take some time to give some explanations. So the matter at hand here is for Robert Alexy to establish the truth or the adequacy the Alexy's concept of law is labeled inclusive non-positivism that you are all aware of. And from a meta-theoretical perspective, the adequacy or the truth of his concept is conditioned by the truth of two theses. The first thesis, of course, being the existence of a necessary conceptual connection between law and morality. And the second thesis being the existence of objective and absolute moral elements, okay? So the two theses must be true jointly for his concept to be deemed theoretically adequate. So I'm going to deal today with his argumentation, the argumentation that he proposes in order to establish the second thesis. I am going to assume methodologically that the first thesis, that is, that there is such a thing as a necessary conceptual connection between law and morality, is correct, that the conjunction of analytical and normative arguments that he proposes in order to establish the first thesis is convincing and satisfactory, okay? But that's a methodological stance. I don't agree with that construction. So, I'd like first to explain how important is for Alexy to demonstrate that there is such a thing as an absolute objective system of morality. So the problem here is that if the second thesis, if there were not any absolute and objective moral elements, the notion of extreme injustice that I guess you are familiar with, which constitute the heart of the Radbruch formula, would become completely subjective. So in a couple of words, the Radbruch formula states that extreme injustice is not law, okay? When the moral content of the legislation goes beyond a certain threshold in the injustice, it loses automatically its legal validity, okay? And so what is at stake here with the establishment, the identification of an absolute morality is not only the theoretical establishment of the adequacy of his concept, but also the practical use of the Radbruch formula by the judges once when they will have to let us say formulate a moral appraisal of the content of the legislation. Okay, so that is what is at hand. And if Alexy is unable to justify such an existence, then the judge will be, of course, able to say that such or such statute is extremely unjust based on their own subjective moral preferences. And that would be, from a practical perspective, absolutely detrimental to the rule of law. That would be to the expense of course, very detrimental to the stability of the legal system. They would be able to make prevail their own subjective moral orientation on the positivity of the legislation. So they need to be true altogether, those two theses. So I'm going to focus on Alexy's argumentation to establish the second one. So what is the problem here Alexy is facing? Alexy is confronted with the classic relativistic counter-argument that is traditionally put forth by the positivist legal philosopher. And among those, of course, we count Hans Kelsen, you all know this. And Hans Kelsen argues that there is no such a thing as an absolute morality, okay? That is a morality that would be valid independently from any consideration of space and time, okay? Hence, when we formulate some more moral, let us say, appraisal of the content of the legislation, we formulate value judgments that stem from a specific system of morals, okay? But due to the fact that there are multiple systems of morals, we could formulate a multiplicity of value judgments that would lead to very different consequences. And furthermore, as we are unable to discriminate between the competing system of morals, one should not connect law and morality, because we wouldn't be able to say with which morality we should connect law from a substantial perspective, okay, in order to analyze a little bit the moral, let us say, value, the moral merit or demerit of the positive legislation, okay? So, in order to identify an absolute value, Kelsen precises, and that's very important, that the identification must be led a priori. That is to say that it automatically excludes what is commonly labeled as being the positive morality. That is the morality that is currently shared within a given social group at a certain time. That is the positive morality. Such a morality is not absolute, as it is contingently shared by a group during a certain period of time, but it might change. It does not satisfy the absolute criteria that is put forth by Kelsen, right? So it has to be identified in an a priori fashion, not an a posteriori fashion. That is a very important aspect. Okay, so if I have to translate this classic counter-argument that is held by the positivists in metaethical terms, I would say that in order to thwart adequately this classic argument that is put forth by Kelsen, Alexy needs to identify a priori a system of morals so it can be absolute in the sense that it is independent from any consideration of space and time. And the meta-ethical orientation that embodies such requirements is called ethical non-realism, which holds that values are non-natural entities, they are non-spatial temporal entities, and they are given a priori, okay? So it excludes also from a meta-ethical perspective the possibility of providing a constructivist approach to the foundation of moral values. What is constructivism in a couple of words to put it very simply? So constructivism as a metaethical stance in its objective trend holds that values are constructed through an impartial analysis of the principles, categories, whatever, values governing a certain empirical fact at a certain time. And those empirical facts can be a practice, for instance, or object, whatever. So values or categories or universals constructed following a constructivist methodology exist inherently and are instantiated within the practice based on which they are constructed. They only exist contingently, and hence constructivism is a form of relativism. So we cannot instrumentalize a constructivist stance in order to provide an adequate answer to the relativist challenge formulated by Kelsen. And furthermore, I should precise here that constructivism is an a posteriori mode of identification, because of course we need to experience a certain empirical practice to construct. So it needs experience. A priori means without experience, okay? A posteriori means with experience, to put it simple, okay? So the ontological, the corresponding stance to constructivism at the ontological level is called, I call it Platonism in the paper, or it is also called ontological conceptualism, or idealism. And that holds that the non-spatial, spatial-temporal entities such as concepts, values, universal, only enjoy a secondary ontological status as they are derived from empirical objects or practices. They do not exist absolutely. They only exist in a conditional fashion, if I may say so. If the practice or the object out of which they are constructed disappears, well, then those values, those concepts, those universals disappear altogether, okay, with the empirical facts out of which they are extracted. That is very important, okay. So now that I have a little bit settled, if I may say so, the framework, I can now turn to Robert Alexy's argumentation, okay? So, of course, for Robert Alexy, as you know, there is such a thing as absolute moral standards. And according to Alexy, those absolute moral standards are the human rights, okay? So, Alexy, according to Alexy, human rights bear 5 characteristics. They are moral rights, they are universal rights, fundamental rights, they are abstract rights, and are rights that take priority over any other kind of norms, okay? That's very important. And so what we must remember here and take into consideration are the 2 first characteristics, okay? So they are, human rights are moral rights. And as moral elements, Alexy maintains that the validity and the existence of moral rights depends only on their justifiability, okay? That means that to establish the existence and the objectivity of the human rights, we need to justify them. Okay, that is the first element. The second characteristic is that they are universal. That means that not only we have to justify the existence, but we have to justify universally their existence. That is to say, in front of any participant to a rational discourse. That's Alexy's point. They need to be justified, and they need to be justified universally if we are to consider that they exist and that they are objective moral elements, okay? So let's now jump into the argumentation proposed by Alexy. So very quickly, he proposes two arguments, a logical or pragmatic or transcendental argument or explicative argument. And he couples this explicative or logical transcendental argument with an existential argument that is a normative argument. So let's jump right into the pragmatico transcendental argument first. So the basic structure of a pragmatic or transcendental argument is the following. Okay, so we take a human practice, that's the first step, and we consider such a human practice as being necessary in some sense. Then the second step, we identify a concept or a rule or a set of concepts or rules and establish that such concepts or rules are necessary if we are to give meaning and signification to this very same practice that we have previously identified, okay? And the conclusion of the pragmatic or transcendental argument is that those categories or rules that we have identified, they exist and they are valid, okay? That's the structure of the pragmatic or transcendental argument. And Alexy applies it to discourse. Okay, so according to Alexy, discourse is a human practice that is characterized following Robert Brandom by the fact of giving reasons, asking for reasons, putting forth theses, exchanging arguments, okay? And such a practice, according to Robert Alexy, is governed by a set of rules, right? They are contained in his famous book, The Theory of Legal Argumentation. He follows Habermas greatly on that matter. And so Alexy adds that those rules defining and governing the discursive activity substantially express the human rights. Substantially express the human rights in which sense? There is a set of rules that he calls pragmatic rules that deals with the position of the participants within the discourse. And those rules express the ideals of liberty of each participant and autonomy of each participant. He adds that the liberty and the autonomy of the participant constitute the cornerstone of the human rights. Okay, so he says basically that the rules governing the discursive activity substantially express human rights. So the conclusion of his argument is this: wherever there is discursive activity, the discursive activity takes place, the rules that govern and identify the discursive activity are valid and exist. And as those same rules express human rights, hence, wherever there is a discursive activity, there are human rights. Okay, that is basically the structure of Alexy's pragmatical transcendental argument. So then at this point, of course, the main problem with this, the main limitation with this argument is the universality of the discursive activity. Because of course, when we use language, we do not use necessarily language in a discursive way. We might refuse, in fact, to enter into discourse. We might use language to joke, to make joke. I might use language to lie. I might not even use language at all, right? So the problem he's facing now is universality. And so for that reason, Alexy adds a second argument, which is a normative argument, an existential argument. But I am not going to enter into much details here regarding this argument, because as being a normative argument, it's a very weak argument. In order to help Alexy, we are going here from now on consider methodologically that we all universally engage into the discursive practice, and that hence the human rights are, let us say, universally valid. Okay, so that is the points where we're at this moment. So At this point, Alexy adds that this foundation is metaphysical. The foundation of the human rights is metaphysical. And resorting to metaphysics is absolutely necessary in the sense that the human rights, qua moral elements or moral rights, are not empirical entities that can be grasped or perceived using the five senses, right? Okay, so we cannot grasp them by watching, by sensing, whatever. So we need to resort to metaphysics. And so this metaphysics that Alexy advocates in order to establish the existence of the human rights is a metaphysics that he labels constructivist, which is, here we have a small issue because he does not define into details his constructivist metaphysics, right? He says that it's rational metaphysics and that it is a metaphysics that is deeply connected to the German philosopher's Frege, that is called Frege, notion of objectivity, right? So we're going to abandon, we are going to leave it that way for the moment and conclude that based on this previous logical transcendental argument and the metaphysics that Alexy proposes, the human rights, understood as moral elements, can be said to exist objectively in a Fregean sense, and that they are valid universally, okay? And hence, Alexy considers at this point that he has thwarted the classic relativist argument, counter-argument that is put forth by the positivist legal philosopher, and that he has established the second thesis, that is the existence thesis, that there are absolute moral elements, okay? That is quite clear for now. Okay, so in order to appraise a little bit his construction, and to grasp it a little more, I would like to say very quickly, very schematically, a few words regarding Frege's notion of objectivity. That is very important to understand the reach of his construction. So, because of course, they are objective, the human rights, in a Fregean sense. So we need to understand what Frege's notion of objectivity is. So in a couple of words, Frege identifies three ontological realms. The first ontological realm being the external realm or the physical realm that is populated by any sort of physical object. They are spatial and temporal entities that exist independently from any human beings, okay? They objectively exist in a sense outside of ourselves. They belong to the external world. The second ontological realm is the psychological realm, or the internal realm, that is populated by, for instance, the sensations, the psychological elements, such as the sensations that are produced by, for instance, watching, observing the external world, right? The objects of the external world. So the characteristics of the object populating this realm is that they are dependent. A sensation, contrary to a physical object of the external world, cannot exist without someone to bear it, right? A sensation does not exist like that in thin air, right? They need a human being to bear it to be said to exist, okay? And then there is a third realm, that is the realm that is populated by the objective entities, okay? And that is the realm that we are interested in right now, because the human rights, according to Alexy's argumentation, they belong to this third realm, this objective realm, ontological realm in a Fregean sense. So the entities populating the third realm are non-spatio-temporal entities, such as concepts, universals, categories, values, okay? So they are non-physical, okay? So that is a characteristic they share with the object of the second realm, of the psychological realm. They are non-physical objects, but contrary to the object of the second realm and similarly to the object of the first realm, they exist independently from any human beings, okay? They exist independently, quite independently from the fact that someone bears it at a specific moment of history or not, okay? So it's a third realm. It shares characteristics with the two realms, but it goes beyond, and so they are non-spatial temporal entities. They exist objectively outside of us, and they are eternal. They are everlasting truth. And so what Frege has in mind when he thinks about the third realm specifically is, for instance, the mathematical theorems. For instance, the Pythagoras theorems. We can think about it, about Thales theorems. That so those theorems, those mathematical theorems, have always existed. They have always been true, whether or not at some point a genius, a brilliant mathematician, by the production of a rational act of the mind, has grasped them and given them a name, right? They have always existed and have always been true and will always be true, okay? So that is the type of entities, to give you a concrete example, that Frege has in mind when he conceived the third ontological realm, okay? And so they are, I want to stress something, that they are strictly independent, right? They are strictly independent. And if we had to analyze or to translate the third realm, Frege's third realm, into an ontological stance, if we had to label it in an ontological stance, it would be some sort of Platonism, or what we could also call ontological realism, that holds that there is such a thing as physical or non-physical objects that exist objectively outside of us, in a non-secondary status. They exist outside for themselves, right? They exist for themselves, by themselves, whether or not they are human beings, okay? And so once I have briefly characterized Frege's metaphysics, so the question is, can we really consider that the human rights, as they have been established by Alexy, exist in such a strong and absolute objective sense? And my answer is no. My answer is no. And I'm going to give you three concluding remarks, and I will leave the ground. I have already been too long, but I hope it hasn't been too, too heavy, or that I have found some sort of middle ground between everything. So my conclusion, I have three conclusions to leave you with, and I leave you the ground. So my first conclusion goes like this. So based on the logical transcendental argument that I have precedently exposed, and on the ontological signification of Frege's notion of objectivity, my conclusion is that his metaphysics is inconsistent. Inconsistent because the logical transcendental argument, or the pragmatic or transcendental argument, stems from what we could call an ontological conceptualist stance, while Frege's notion of objectivity stems from ontological realism. And those two, let us say, ontological stances are completely diverse. That is, something that is established by the use of a logical transcendental argument doesn't have the ontological density that is that of an entity that is said to be existing based on ontological realism, okay? Because as I have explained, an entity that is established using a logical transcendental argument is dependent on the existence of the practice, of the empirical practice out of which they stem. Without this practice, it does not exist. And remember, conceptual Frege's notion of objectivity holds that the entities exist for themselves, out of themselves, only for themselves. They have a primary ontological status, while the entities that stem from non-logical transcendental arguments only have a secondary ontological status, okay? So the problem is that he's mixing here, Alexy, two ontological universes that are completely different. So his metaphysics, and that is my first conclusion, is inconsistent. My second conclusion then is that if we set aside the highly problematic reference to Frege's notion of objectivity, right, we're going to abandon this reference because, I mean, it does not fit in the picture. From a meta-ethical perspective, what we are left with is a form of objective constructivism that I have previously defined at the beginning. And the problem with this stance is twofold. First, it's a relativist metaethical stance because the values identified and constructed are only contingent and not absolute, as their existence, as I've said, depends on the existence of certain practices. So they have a secondary derivative ontological status. And the second issue here is that this meta-ethical stance is structurally inadequate to thwart the relativist argument that has been formulated by Hans Kelsen, because I recall it required that the values be identified a priori. That is without resorting to any sort of experience, so they can be absolute. Whereas here, in the framework of a constructivist stance, they are identified a posteriori, that is following the observation of an empirical practice. So my conclusion is that not only his metaphysics is inconsistent, but if we abandon Frege's reference, in fact, the constructivist metaethical stance that he develops is structurally inadequate to thwart the classic relativistic argument that is put forth by the positivist. And as I have said, he should have argued in favor of what I have called, what is labeled as ethical non-naturalism. He does not argue for the good metaethical stance. And hence, consequence, and I will stop here, is that, well, according to Alexy's words, in fact, if the existence thesis is wrong, automatically positivism prevails as being the adequate theory of law. Okay, so of course I will not go as far as to say that positivism prevails or anything, but I would just like to say that in this present state of development, the inclusive non-positivism that is advocated by Alexy is not a viable theory of law. Is not a viable theory of law because the existence thesis is not adequately established, and because, of course, without the possibility of identifying absolute moral standards, we cannot morally appraise the content of the positive legislation without resorting to some sort of subjective moral orientation. So this is my conclusion. I'm not saying, though, it's not an absolute conclusion, because I am not saying that Alexy could not provide a satisfactory argumentation, okay? But I'm just saying that this argumentation is not satisfactory, and that hence his concept is not adequate in this present state of development. So I thank you for your attention. I hope I haven't been too heavy. I tried to remain schematical and pedagogic, if I may say so. So if there is any obscurity that you would like me to enlighten or anything, of course, you feel free. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Romain. Bom, para quem chegou agora, a gente vai ter agora as ponderações do professor João Costa Neto e depois a gente vai abrir para todas e todos. Para quem chegou depois também, as perguntas podem ser feitas em inglês ou espanhol. Para quem, né, tem uma dificuldade, pode falar em português, a gente traduz e aí a gente organiza depois aqui no chat. Então, já passo desde já a palavra para o professor João Costa Neto. Thank you, Romain, for the excellent explanation.
My pleasure.
Romain, thank you very much for your excellent presentation. Thank you, everybody, for coming. So I actually agree with many criticisms against Alexy, especially the one from Joseph Raz, who is a positivist and has written a very well-known paper against Alexy. It's an honor to be here, as I said at the beginning, PósDebate, right at the very first year, so it's very nice to see. Thank you very much for the invitation, Luis and Rebecca. So, first of all, I would just briefly like to speak about what inclusive non-positivism is, because it's really a term, expression that Alexy created. It means basically that sometimes unjust laws are still law. That's the thing. So even if a law is very unjust, it is still the law. But, and that is very similar to what positivists say. So what Alexy holds against a positivist philosopher, legal philosopher, is that some laws are so extremely unjust that they are not law at all. They fail as law. So one example is Nazi law. Let's think about the Nazi regime in Germany in World War II, for example. So many laws were at such an extent extremely unjust that he contends that they fail what many philosophers think is an essential character of law, and it's called the claim to correctness. So I'll try to explain this kind of briefly. The thing is, Hart, the famous Oxford philosopher, in his book, The Concept of Law, tried to grasp with a problem that is very common in legal philosophy. Augustine, the Catholic philosopher, wrote about it in his book, The City of God, and he asks the following question: What are kingdoms if not great robber bands? So the thing is, what is the difference between a state and between criminals? Is it just a matter of quantity? Because the states are big criminals because they have power, they have armies and so forth? Or is there a moral difference between, for example, a criminal state like the Nazi regime, the Nazis, and a big robber band, a big bunch of criminals that, for example, rob people and they kill people and so forth? So after many, many years discussing this problem, Joseph Raz came up with the following answer. It is an essential feature of a legal system that it claims to be morally correct. So, for example, even though many atrocities were committed in Germany by the Nazis, they still claimed they were doing the morally right thing for the people in general. And that's the big difference between a criminal. A criminal just points a gun at you and he asks for your money. He doesn't claim he's doing good for you or for the society in general. But states, even though they may be very authoritarian or ruled by dictatorships, or you name it, or very violent, and even if they disrespect every single human right, they still have a claim to moral correctness. And Alexy gives an interesting example. He says it would be quite strange and totally not law if there was a constitution that said that the country X, any country, is a sovereign, federal, and unjust republic. It seems contrary to the very nature of a legal system and of law to say from the beginning that a certain legal system is unjust, because law systems, even if they fail, even if they are extremely unjust, they always claim to do something just in general. If they do not, they are not really legal systems. They're just a bunch of criminals that are big enough to control a territory. Perhaps Somalia is an example of something that is not a state. And the UN, for example, does not recognize Somalia as a state, really, because it's just a bunch of terrorists and criminals that are there. So that's inclusive non-positivism. Alexy defends a inclusive non-positivism because he thinks sometimes when the law is extremely unjust, extremely, just in very extreme cases, it fails as law. That's the thing. So, and of course, it's a very strong argument, and I think Romain has pointed out some very interesting things. But I'll try to defend Alexy, even though I'm not totally sympathetic to what he claims. But I'll do my best. I'll try to really state his position, and I think it's plausible in many aspects. So the thing he probably would say, and I've said him say that personally, is that his theory is connected to his theory of legal argument. So the thing is, you have the legal argumentation is constructed in practical discourse. So Romain says in his text, how will I know if something is extremely unjust? And how can Alexy say there are objective truths? Well, I'll give some examples just to try to defend a position that in Brazil I think is not very popular, that there are some moral truths. That is kind of popular in the US, in Germany, but not really in Brazil. So I don't think anyone would dispute that, for example, the following proposition is morally objective and true. Torturing babies for fun is wrong. I think this is pretty objective. I mean, it doesn't really matter if somebody disagrees. Slavery is wrong. And torture, at least in almost all the cases, if not in all the cases, is wrong. So moral problems are very messy. They're difficult. It's difficult to really try to find out who is right and who is wrong. But there are objective moral truths. They're just very hard to find. And especially because, and this is why I think there's no contradiction in Alexy's point, in this point that Romain criticized. The fact that he is a constructivist does not make him a relativist. And I'll explain myself. Look, all that he's saying is that there are no moral facts out there in the fabric of the world. See, if we want to prove something, a scientific fact or theory, really, we can just, at least in theory, we can just go out there, take a look at the facts, and see and check if our theory matches the facts. I think this is very naive. Even in hard sciences, there's no such a thing as this clear this correspondence of facts and theory. There are a lot of problems in science itself, but in morality, it's even bigger. I mean, it's even harder. Let's think about something as abortion. We can't just make an experiment or take a thermometer or just try to measure something to see if abortion in the first trimester of pregnancy is or is not morally acceptable. So how do we do it? And that's the thing. And Alexy says that all the time. We argue, we talk about it, and sometimes we won't reach a conclusion. But and he does concede, and that's very important because it sets him apart from Dworkin, for example. He does say many times that, I'll just quote him to make sure he says, even though legal argumentation is rational, many interpretations will be objectively ruled out. But according to him, it is also true that competing interpretations might be equally rational at the end of the legal discourse. So that's the thing. Sometimes we have to make choices. And he leaves that pretty clear. I mean, let's think about constitutional rights, about free speech and privacy. Sometimes constitutional courts have to make a choice and set what he calls a conditional primacy or preference. And he said, in this given case, free speech will prevail over privacy. Of course, there is a choice that is made. in balancing all the relevant facts and legal arguments involved. But that does not mean it is relativist, because at the end of the day, we can still ascribe a truth value to the proposition. And by the way, that's my next point. I think there are different, there's a famous article from Andrei Marmor, who is a very well-known positivist. He is a disciple from Ras. He also comes from Israel. He's a professor in the US. He did his PhD at Oxford with Joseph Ras. And he says there are at least 3 different concepts of objectivity. So something, when you say something is objective, for example, as Alexy does, moral values, human rights, you may mean different things. And I think Romain presupposes that Alexy has a metaphysical objectivity. He thinks there are really moral truths are really out there to be discovered, and that is not really, even though some parts of Alexy's texts might mislead us. I think that is not the rational thing to read from him. I think if we have a little generosity, and we'll find out that what he really means is the 3rd concept of objectivity, and it only means that it makes sense to ascribe a truth value. So at the end of the day, we will argue, we will think about slavery, about torture, about torturing babies for fun, and we will check if it makes sense to ascribe a truth value to each of these propositions. And I think it really does. I mean, it really, I think it's pretty clear. But look, there's no Archimedean point. There's no mathematical argument. How do I know that? Well, I can only give you further arguments, and we can always argue, and you can question the premises I'm taking for granted, and so forth. So there's no safe point that is unquestionable. I will always have to give reasons, and that is why Alexy's theory is clearly a discourse theory, a theory based on practical discourse, but it is constructivist, but it is not relativist. Because even though we're trying to figure out what truth value we should ascribe to a certain legal proposition or moral proposition, it still makes sense to ascribe truth or false value to them. That's the very thing. So it's clear to me that Frege's objectivity is not what Alexy has in mind, even though he might hint at it sometimes, but I don't think it is. Or if it is, we have to just say that he slipped a little. It's not. It doesn't make really sense. I agree with Romain there. And also I strongly believe that he's totally against Kelsen's skepticism. I mean, Kelsen was a great legal philosopher, and he really had a very proper worldview, and he thought, and his relativism was really close to his legal positivism. And Alexy disagrees clearly, and I don't think, as Romain said in his text, that Alexy's argument somehow depends on Kelsen's premises or his skepticism. I think they kind of talk past each other, and Alexy really rejects the notion that there would be that moral values are always and totally subjective. To the contrary, he is very clear. He says that his theory of legal argumentation, and that's what really makes us understand and what makes sense about talking about human rights and universal human rights and stuff. He believes there's a way to speak about such things rationally, objectively, and correctly. That's the thing. So I do believe that sometimes it's a strong premise. I won't question that. We may disagree, but I think it is consistent. And the bite of Romain's criticism is that if we accept it, it doesn't only make Alexy's argument unsound, it makes it inconsistent. And even though I agree that with, for example, Ross criticisms, I do not think the inconsistent pointed out by Romain is true. And I really want to talk about that. So the thing is, just to sum up, I think Alexy agrees that there are no moral facts for us to discover out there in the fabric of the world. No, there aren't. But still, it makes sense to speak about things that are true. And why are there, for example, universal human rights or universal legal arguments rules? Well, because they're so strong that we think, or at least he thinks, that they are they make sense in every single case, that they do not depend on the factual circumstances. And just to make it more concrete, his examples of universal legal argument rules, for example, are very abstract. For example, one of them in law, and he thinks it is universal, is every time one tries to go against a precedent, one has the burden of argumentation. Well, perhaps we might think it isn't universal. I'm not sure. I've thought about it, and I can't find one instance in which it doesn't make sense, but maybe we can. But still, he thinks it makes so much sense. And you can see that it's kind of vague and imprecise, that it will always be true. But it does make sense at first sight, at least. And that's why it is universal. It isn't that it's written somewhere in a metaphysical world that we have to discover. It's just that it makes a lot of sense. It is plausible. It is justified. And we or Alexy at least, can't think of a certain point in which this rule or this human value or right wouldn't make sense. It's just like I said, I can't think of any possible world in which torturing babies for fun would be morally correct. It's just plainly wrong. In any case, it's objectively wrong. Well, and again, it's very messy, but I think it's the best we can say about Alexy and the best way we can try to defend his arguments. I mean, I'm not an ambassador from him. I'm not really, I don't agree with him as much as it might seem when you hear me talk, but for the sake of the argument and of the debate, I try to make his ideas look as rational as possible. And I hope to hear more from Romain and from all of you. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor João Costa Neto. And now we're going to open for the questions. And so I'm gonna talk in Portuguese. Bom, a gente está aberto para as perguntas. A gente queria organizar pelo chat, então, assim, quem tiver ponderações para fazer, às vezes também não é só uma pergunta, vocês gostariam de fazer ponderações sobre o que o Romain falou, que o professor João Costa falou, a gente está aberto. E aí depois a gente vai abrir para também o Romain, né, fazer as ponderações sobre o que o professor João Costa falou e as perguntas de vocês. A Isadora vai fazer uma pergunta, a gente vai colocar aqui no chat. Tem mais alguém que gostaria de fazer? A gente vai colher de 3 em 3 perguntas. Mais alguém? Que aí a gente já começa com a Isadora e aí o Romain já pode fazer as ponderações dele. Isadora, se você quiser abrir, né, o fone, você pode fazer a pergunta já diretamente. Pode fazer em inglês ou espanhol, tá?
Tá bem, obrigada. Vou fazer em inglês, vou tentar, né? So, good morning. My name is Isadora. I study law at UNB, and first I want to thank you for the meeting. So my question is for Alexy. Different speakers cannot use the same expression with different meanings. So with that in mind, what is the concept of moral used by Alexy? I understood when Romain say about not starting from a constructivist or relativist idea, but what is moral to Alexy was not clear to me. Thank you.
Thank you, Isadora. And we have another question of Professor Nelson Gonçalves. Let me see. Oh.
I'd like first to pose a question to Monsieur Geniez, which is about metaphysics. He said metaphysics is inconsistent, and at least Alexy's metaphysics is inconsistent, I suppose. Okay, I would like to know, what does it mean to be inconsistent? Because in logic, inconsistent is something like contradictory. And is it contradictory, or it is inconsistent accordingly to another definition? That's the question I had to Dr. Geniez. Well, my second point is about this idea of a Platonic word, which would be the basis of this kind of theory. Anyway, if you speak about a Platonic word, if you speak about a word of objects that exist independently of human beings, etc., and they have some relations among themselves which are eternal, let's say like this. Well, if you say something like this, you have to admit the existence of a word which has no causal effects, because empirical word has causal effect, an empirical word. A stone, for example, can hurt someone, okay? It's an empirical object, but ideas have no causal effects. And if you think of a system of law based upon this kind of objects, well, it has no effectiveness, and that's the point. Therefore, you cannot speak, you cannot justify, let's say like this, the history of law. If you see the very distant past, the Hammurabi Code and other systems of laws, you'll see a lot of very unfair, unjust laws, etc. Okay, unjust, but effective. They were adopted by judges. They were the basis of judicial decisions, if we like or not. I don't like this, but that's true. That's the history of law. And this is the point, I would say, that a world of objects which are independent of our mind has no causal effects, and a world of rules, a set of rules, which is Platonic, has no effectiveness, historical effectiveness. And then you have to give up the idea of a history of law. There is no such a thing as a history of law if you adopt this very Platonic basis for the law, according to Mr. Geniez's explanation. But I would like to listen Mr. Geniez's opinion about that. And my first question about metaphysics inconsistency. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Nelson Gonçalves. And Romain, it's your time to answer the questions. And Professor João, you also can point some things that you want to
Sure. Thank you.
Okay.
If you allow me, I would just like to say that Professor Nelson taught me philosophy at the University of Brasilia. He is a great philosopher, a great friend, and I'm very happy and surprised to have him here. Thank you, Professor. It's an honor to have you here with us.
Thank you. I thank you very much.
Oh,
Thank you.
Okay, there I am. Okay, there has been a lot of things that been said by the different participants here. So would be a lot to comment on. But first of all, I'd like to say a couple of words regarding what João said concerning the problem of the existence of moral truth. Well, that there is such a thing as moral truth, my dear João, is highly doubtful. For instance, you took the example of the babies, that you cannot conceive a world in which torturing babies for fun could be something that would be moral. But João, I mean, maybe I should just remind you that, for instance, the Mayans during, like, for instance, I mean, during the 16th century and before, used to make sacrifices, human sacrifices, babies. They used to sacrifice human beings, and that would be seen as something highly moral. So I am very uncomfortable with the idea, with this very Occidental-centered idea that there could be something as moral truth, and that the content of those moral truths would be, of course, the content of the human rights, right? As they have been historically developed here in our Occidental world, and that it would be universally true. I am quite uncomfortable, and furthermore, when it comes to ascribing a certain truth to moral propositions, in fact, Alexy uses the term correctness and not exactly the term truth, and we shall remind that a moral judgment, according to Alexy, can be correct if it has been produced following the argumentative procedure that he has set, but that a moral judgment is rational and correct in this procedural sense does not mean that it is absolutely true. It is correct as it has been correctly produced, procedurally speaking, right? So it doesn't mean that it is true in a strong sense. The concept of correctness would be a very weak concept of truth. So I don't think that there can be such a thing, because as moral truth, because history shows that the conceptions of morality, of the diverse civilization, can vary a lot, and a moral universe, our moral universe of Occidental people, might not make a lot of sense, for instance, for the Mayans who used to make sacrifices. So that's why, according to me, there is no such a thing. I can understand Alexy's idea of a procedural correctness and the consequent idea of correct judgments of value, but they are not true in a strong sense. Then, when I use just a clarification, when I talk about Frege's notion of objectivity, first of all, I'd like to point that it is not me who uses Frege's notion of objectivity and who states that the human rights exist in an objective fashion as Frege's used to conceive it. It is Alexy himself. He argues, and he's the one who frames the question of the existence problem, as he labels it, right? So he says that we need to identify an absolute morality that is independent from any consideration of space and time. And I don't think that following his argumentation, it can be said that the human rights are absolute in such a strong sense. And I don't understand your point, but I would like to hear you, João, regarding that matter. I really don't understand how constructivism can be, from a metaethical perspective, anything other than relativism. because by definition, the categories, the values that are constructed based on the observation of a certain human practice and that are conceived as an inherent system of concept that we must deem valid necessarily in order to give sense and signification can be said to be absolutely existent. Because by definition, if such a practice, if this very same practice evolves or disappears, then the values disappears. So I don't understand how the constructivist stance can lead to an absolute conclusion when it comes to the identification of moral elements. Like really, this is really a point of concern, something that I can't understand. And maybe if you can explain that to me, I would be very glad. And if there was such a thing, that would probably, of course, destroy a little bit my point here. So maybe you can comment on that. Well, there would be a lot to be said about João's intervention, but I will pass on to Isadora's question. So, what is the content of morality according to Alexy? Well, basically, Alexy is a Kantian. That is, he believes that the absolute value, that is the cornerstone of all the others, is the value of autonomy, from which stems the ideals of liberty, etc. So he's a Kantian. Basically, that leads to the human rights. That is the set of values that Alexy has in mind, and that's what I've said. Like, when it comes to identifying the content of the morality, he equals the content of morality with the content of human rights that he understands as moral elements, as I have characterized it. Okay, so that's the content of morality according to Alexy. And then when it comes to Professor Gonçalves' question, which I thank him for his question, and I thank him for his presence here. So first of all, what do I mean by when I say that he's inconsistent? So I might not be using here a very clear-cut concept of inconsistency when I judge his metaphysics to be inconsistent. What I say is that he uses intellectual tools that stems from two ontological worlds that are completely separate, that he tries to mix them together to form something new. He uses conceptual tools stemming from ontological conceptualism when he uses the logical or pragmatic or transcendental arguments. Okay, and while he uses the notion of Frege's notion of subjectivity, that stems clearly from a Platonician ontological stance or from ontological realism. And so he tries to mix everything together to lift, if I may say, to give the ontological density of if I may say so, a conceptual and ontological, realism to something that has been established using tools stemming from ontological conceptualism. He tries to give, the ontological consistency of ontological realism to something that has been established using the tools of ontological conceptualism. And that's in this sense that I said that his metaphysics is inconsistent. You cannot have it both ways. You either are a conceptual, an ontological conceptualist, or an ontological realist. You cannot be both ways. And I I understand the reason why he uses this reference to Frege's notion of objectivity in the course of his argumentation. And the reason I have stated it at the beginning, it is because of the fact that he resorts to Kelsen's formulation of the problem regarding the identification of value. And Kelsen states that those values must be identified a priori. They must be absolute in the strongest sense possible. And conceptual ontological conceptualism is not as strong as that. He needs to resort to to Frege's notion of objectivity to lift, if I may say so, ontologically his conclusion. But by doing so, according to me, he creates some sort of, he generates some sort of ontological jumps. He jumps from one ontological universe to the other, and I mean that cannot be done according to me. Then again, when it comes to the question of effectiveness, well, again, according to Alexy, I am stating I am quoting Alexy here, and all I am, and I would say that I do not understand exactly Alexy on that matter, but he understands the legal norms as being objective entities, as Frege conceives it. He says, like, legal norms, they are not psychological elements, they are not physical elements, they are objective elements in the Fregean sense. And to answer your question regarding the consequences of such a conception on effectiveness and the problem of causality, well, I don't know. I'm sorry, but in fact, I don't know. I don't even understand how one can say that the content of the legislation is objective in a Fregean sense. For me, it makes no sense, because the content of the legislation is a creation, is not something that has been rationally discovered. As Frege states it, the elements populating the third realm they are grasped by a rational mind, while the legal norms, they are created by an act of will, following Kelsen's terminology. So first of all, I don't understand his use of Frege's notion of objectivity as applied to characterize the ontology of the legal norms. So I beg your pardon, Professor Gonçalves, but I don't have an answer to your question. And I'm glad, I would be glad to hear it from you, maybe, but I don't know. Thank you.
Professor Gonçalves has some observations to do. So I think, like, Professor Gonçalves can do his observations, and after that, I think Professor João can say, like, his points.
It's only a very short suggestion, actually, to Mr. Geniez. I would say that perhaps instead of saying that metaphysics is inconsistent, because, you know, this is a word of logic that may cause some misunderstanding, it would perhaps be better to say that metaphysics, according, well, in this sense of Alexis, metaphysics is incongruent.
Incongruent, okay.
Incongruent, perhaps a better word.
Indeed.
Thank you. And thank you, Mr. Geniez. I like very much your exposition.
Thank you very much, Professor Gonçalves, for your suggestion. And indeed, maybe there is some, if I may say so, I haven't been very careful maybe when I have translated my article, I mean the piece of my PhD thesis, of my doctoral thesis in English. Maybe there is also indeed, I might not use the proper English word. Thank you very much for your suggestion, Professor.
I thank you. Thank you.
Professor, maybe Costa Neto.
Oh, that's okay. That's my very short suggestion. I like very much your exposition. Thank you.
Thank you.
So, Romain, thank you very much. About the science, I would just like to say that just because it was done, and I'm not sure if you tried to claim that, just because it is done, it doesn't mean it is right. I mean, people don't pay taxes all the time. Does it make it morally wrong or right just because it is done? I mean, historical examples are, we have plenty of them. Slavery, was it right just because it was done for so many years to enslave people? it actually, in deontic logic, it's even a fallacy. It's a fallacy to say that from P, from something that is the fact, to say that it is permitted to do P. So just to make it clear, from the fact that people are killed, it doesn't mean it is permissible to kill people. I mean, even in Brazil, let's think about it. People are killed all the time. It happens. Just like you said, Mayans killed babies. Well, okay, it happens, but does it make it right? That's the point. So just because we have historical examples, there were tortures, there were all, I mean, we can think of, even today, let's think about women that are killed just because they are unfaithful in some Muslim countries. Does it make it right to kill these women just because they were unfaithful, because of the fact that some countries do that? I don't think it does. I think it's a very weak argument. History teaches us, gives us many examples of very bad things and very good things. And the fact that they happened means nothing from a morally point of view. And from the about the constructivism and relativism thing, John Rawls, for example, is a famous author who is both a constructivist and a moral realist and objectivist. He really believes there are objective moral answers to very arguable and moral dilemmas, really. And so what's the difference? Well, I think, as I said, that when Alexy is a constructivist, just because he does not believe that there are moral facts out there in the world that we have to discuss. So where does moral correctness, how does it come up? Well, it comes up as we argue. I mean, we have to figure it out. It isn't somewhere hidden in planet Earth. It isn't in stones or in the earth. It's a practical thing. And it only really, these moral problems only arise as we are human beings interacting with each other. So that's why it is constructed. It isn't objective out there in some factual way. It isn't written in the fabric of the world. So we have to somehow construct it. But the fact that it is in a certain way made doesn't make it subjective in the sense that anything goes, or that it isn't, or that it doesn't make sense to say, well, this is really objectively, plausibly, justifiably wrong, like killing women because they were unfaithful, torturing babies for fun. Well, we can look at the Mayans and say, yes, they were wrong, or maybe not. Maybe we have a very strong and good argument to say that it was justifiable. But you see, the fact that it was done doesn't make it right. It is actually irrelevant that it was done or not. That's why it is not out there to be discovered. We can take a picture of babies being tortured to see if it happened. It's a factual, empirical thing. But we can't take any picture or make any observation to see if something is morally correct or not. And that's the point. I mean, that's why I think Alexy isn't inconsistent. He can be a constructivist. He can really contend that some legal problems are engendered, they are created, some solutions aren't out there to be discovered, but they still, it still makes sense to say that they are true or false. It is still objective in that sense. And it is rational, even though it is not mathematical. There's no algorithm to see if for example, drugs should be legalized or not, or any other very messy, moral, difficult problem. But still, it is objective in the sense that we can speak about it rationally, we can follow some rules, we can try our best, and we can hope at the end of the day, humanity will improve. And I think it does happen. I mean, history doesn't travel in a straight line. It can be messy. We're living some tough times at the moment, but slavery is practically abolished. War is, from the international public law point of view, officially prohibited. That's a great evolution. There are wars in the world, but not as there were in the past, and so forth. So thank you very, very much, and it's very nice to talk to you, and I really appreciated your text in your presentation.
Thank you, Professor Costa Neto. We have another question from Melissa. I think we have time, and we have like 10 more minutes. So, Melissa, do you want to do your question?
Sim, bom dia a todos e a todas. Eu vou tentar fazer minha pergunta em inglês. Se não conseguir, alguém me ajuda, por favor.
Não tem problema, a gente traduz.
O tema é complexo. So, I'd like to thank you, Romain, for sharing your work with us in the first place. So, I wanna do a quickly observation, maybe trying to help you understand how it's possible to speak in the existence of moral judgments, because I usually study that. So let me try first. I agree with you that the constructivism is a kind of relativism or skepticism, but I don't think that, well, that does not lead us to conclude that moral judgments cannot exist objectively. That's why morality discourse is only possible on the substantive level. So the metaethical discourse makes no sense here, because the epistemology of morality does not work in the same way as the epistemology of physical facts. So the skepticism mixed the two plans. That's what I understand is a perspective to this debate that we have had here. So that's it. It's just an observation that I would like to share.
Thank you, Melissa. Romain, do you want to talk about this? Oh, let me see.
Yeah.
Oh, sorry. I unmuted.
No silencia.
Okay.
There I am. Okay. So thank you, Melissa. But indeed, maybe there is some. I haven't been precise enough when I have been using the terms objective and subjective. Of course, I am not denying at all that in the framework of a specific system of morals and values, one can formulate objective value judgments, of course, that are rational and that are well motivated, okay, well established. I am not denying that at all. But the problem is not whether or not one can formulate rational and objective value judgments from the perspective of a specific system of morals. The problem is whether or not this very same system of morals can be said to be objective and absolute. I mean, that it is not the same question at all. You understand? And that's in this sense, of course, there are objective moral judgments that are formulated from a perspective that is in itself subjective. And that's what Kelsen says, in fact, in the pure theory of law, when he says that one must separate law from morality. It is that basically we could formulate many objective moral judgments, but from many different moral perspectives, or from stemming from the framework of very various systems of morality. But the problem is we wouldn't have the possibility to discriminate at a higher level between those systems of morality that are competing. and that we are using in order to morally appraise the merits or demerits of the legislation that we are analyzing. Okay, so that is the issue that we are tackling. Maybe I haven't been. Of course, the value judgments are objective, but they are always formulated from a subjective perspective, and this subjective perspective is of course even given by the fact that someone chooses certain values, and well, he does not choose others, and this is a subjective act. It cannot be. I don't think that such a first choice of the moral framework can be absolutely objective, so that we can say that my moral framework, your moral framework, or the Mayans' moral framework, or the Nazi moral framework can be said absolutely rational, or it can be the true system of morals. And so that's my point. And when it comes to what João said, yes, I am well aware of the Hume's law, of the Hume's logical law that does not allow us to derive the existence of a norm from a fact. But this is not my point. I am saying that yes, maybe the Mayans used to sacrifice babies or young women or young men for the gods. And I am not saying that it is right because they did it. I am not here making some sort of logical fallacy. What I am merely saying is that according to their own subjective point of view, sacrificing a human being for a god was a highly moral act. And that's what matters. Again, the discussion here is at a higher level. We have our system of morality that most of us share because we are the product of a certain civilization, and of course we can critically appraise the system of morality of the Mayans from our own subjective perspective, and of course formulate value judgments about the Muslim system of values, for instance, when they indeed lapidate women. But that does not mean what I want to say, that our system of value is true and their system of value is wrong. That's all that I am merely saying. That's all I say. So I am not, I think, making some sort of logical fallacy here. I think the question is just different. How can you say, João, that your system of value, for instance, the human rights, is more true, is truer, is the absolute, the real system of values, and that the Mayan system of values is wrong? I mean, I don't think you can discriminate in the end between the system of values, and that is my point. And the problem is that Alexy, as he puts it, as he formulates it, following Kelsen's argument, is that we need to identify an absolute system of value that must be valid independently from any consideration of space and time. Is his argumentation identifying the human rights to constitute such an absolute system of value, if I may say so, conclusive? I don't think it is, for the reasons I have exposed. So I mean, this is just my point. My point is that we can formulate judgmental values on other system of values, saying that whatever the Muslims or the Mayans do is absolutely immoral. Okay, we don't want that, us, let us say, in the Western world, okay, to put it that way, in a rather broad way. But that doesn't mean that we cannot we cannot say that means that our system of value is the true and absolute system of value, because I think that from an ideological perspective, that is exactly what leads to imperialism. We have the true and absolute system of values; the others are wrong. So I mean, this is basically what leads to imperialism. Ideologically, I believe so. I mean, I remind you that the Europeans, starting from the late 18th and of course along the 19th century, used to colonize Africa based on that. We were bringing them civilization. we were bringing civilization to the Africans. We were the bearers of, you know, of the highest values, of the highest aesthetical values, of the highest political values, etc. And we had some sort of civilizing mission was, you know, was on our shoulders. That was our responsibility. That leads to imperialism. I mean, I don't. So I do not agree. There is not an absolute morality. I sincerely don't see how can one sustain such a thesis. And I think that Alexy's point is not reaching what he tries to reach. That is establishing an absolute system of morality. That's it. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Melissa wrote on the chat that she wanted to say that your skeptical position, a relativist position,
okay.
Doesn't let it be to be a moral position also. It is also a moral position.
Sure, yeah. Absolutely. Absolutely it is. No, it is. Of course, I mean, legal positivism as bearing some skepticism. The skepticism in itself has a moral value. No, absolutely. But I do not justify my skepticism, from a moral perspective. But it's a matter of it's more a matter of epistemology here. How can one know that a system of value is absolutely true and that the others are wrong? That is the question at hand. How can one say that a system of value is true and that the other is wrong? But absolutely, you're absolutely right when you say that skepticism can be understood as a moral position, and it is absolutely true that Hans Kelsen himself, in his conception of democracy, used to say that indeed skepticism was at the basis of democracy in itself, and it had moral value. No, you're absolutely right, but it is not my point. It's an epistemological question that I am raising. How can one say that a system of value is absolutely true and that all the others are wrong? Okay, and is the true morality and that the others are false morality? That is my question. Okay.
Thank you so much. I think we have reached our time. So I would like to thank you, Romain. Thank you Professor Costa Neto, and thank you, Professor Gonçalves, Melissa, and all of you that were here like in this morning. And we invite you all to participate in other like debates. And you also, Romain, is invited to.
Thank you.
You are invited to participate to all the debates. And thank you all. And I don't know if Professor Costa Neto wants to do a concluding remark or say something.
Really, I just want to say thank you. Very nice to meet you. Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Rebecca and Maria, for being such a wonderful host.
Thank you, Professor Costa Neto. You are invited to also to send us a paper to debate.
Okay, and I should like also, if you allow me to, just thank every one of you for your participation, for your remarks that have led me to reflect about certain weaknesses of my paper, of my approach. Thank you, Professor Gonçalves, for your terminological suggestion. Thank you, Professor Costa Neto, and the others for your questions. Of course, I'd like to wish you good luck to you, the Brazilians, in those dreadful times and this dreadful period that you are undergoing right now with coronavirus. I hope that you will all be well and that I will have the opportunity and the pleasure to see you again sometimes in the future. Thank you very much for having me.
Thank you so much. And thank you, Professor Gonçalves, for being here. You are also invited to send us a paper to discuss. This will be a pleasure for us. And all of you also are invited. And if someone wants to know like a little bit more about the PósDebate group, just send us an email and we will talk to you all. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. Bye.
Bye.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.